The first device on record did not announce itself as a weapon. It appeared as a therapeutic instrument, a precision apparatus, allegedly designed to calm epileptic seizures and reduce traumatic agitation. Its inventor described it as a harmonic regulator, a machine that emitted carefully modulated electromagnetic fields intended to synchronize neural oscillations. Early demonstrations were held in hospital basements and university annexes, spaces where oversight was assumed rather than verified. Volunteers reported sensations of warmth, disorientation, and an unusual quieting of intrusive thoughts. What was not recorded in the public papers were the secondary effects: memory gaps, altered emotional responses, and a pronounced compliance to verbal suggestion that persisted hours after exposure. Internal correspondence later recovered from a declassified archive suggests that observers recognized something far more consequential than a medical aid. They had stumbled upon a method of externally guiding cognition without chemical intervention. By the late 1950s, the device had been quietly removed from its original laboratory and transferred to a restricted research facility operating under a defense contract. The language used to justify the transfer was deliberately vague, citing dual-use concerns and potential misuse. Yet progress reports reveal a different motivation. Engineers discovered that by shifting the frequency bands into ranges matching specific cortical regions, they could induce targeted effects, heightened fear responses, suppressed critical reasoning, or an artificial sense of trust toward perceived authority figures. Test subjects were no longer patients, but enlisted personnel, selected precisely because their experiences could be sealed under national security statutes. The apparatus was refined, miniaturized, and shielded, its emitters concealed behind panels labeled as routine diagnostic equipment. What followed was a period of intense experimentation that never appeared in scientific journals. Subjects exposed repeatedly showed long-term personality drift, becoming more suggestible, less emotionally reactive, and unusually loyal to institutional structure. When a small internal review committee raised ethical concerns, the project's documentation abruptly stopped. The committee itself was dissolved within months, its members reassigned to unrelated posts. The device did not disappear. It was confiscated, renamed, and buried deeper within a compartmentalized program whose existence would be denied for decades. Later inventory logs refer only to neuro-influence hardware, stored alongside psychological warfare materials rather than medical tools. The second confiscated device emerged from an entirely different context, a privately funded research collective operating on the fringes of academic legitimacy. This group claimed to be investigating the nature of consciousness itself, attempting to map subjective experience as a manipulable variable. Their prototype relied not on electromagnetic fields, but on precisely timed acoustic pulses delivered through bone conduction. When synchronized correctly, these pulses disrupted the brain's internal timing mechanisms, producing vivid hallucinations and a temporary dissolution of self-identity. Participants described the sensation of their thoughts being edited in real time, as if an external hand were rearranging internal narratives. Within weeks of the first successful trials, representatives from a federal agency arrived unannounced, citing violations of safety regulations. The equipment was seized on the spot. Internal memos later leaked suggest that the seizure was motivated by the device's unexpected effectiveness in overriding memory recall. Unlike traditional methods, it left no biochemical trace and produced no visible trauma. Under controlled conditions, entire experiential sequences could be blurred or excised. This capability raised immediate interest from intelligence planners concerned with interrogation, counterintelligence, and the containment of sensitive knowledge. The original researchers were barred from discussing their work, bound by agreements that framed the confiscation as a matter of public protection. In reality, the device was reassembled elsewhere, its creators excluded from further development. A third example illustrates how these confiscations often followed public exposure. During a brief window in the early 1970s, a startup company demonstrated a headset marketed as a focus enhancement tool. Early adopters praised its ability to induce intense concentration and emotional calm. What investors were not told was that internal tests had shown the headset could also implant aversive responses to specific images or phrases. When a journalist began asking questions about military interest in the company, regulators intervened with unusual speed. The product was pulled, the patents classified, and the hardware collected under emergency authority. Officially, the action was taken to protect consumers from unproven technology. Unofficially, the headset's core architecture was integrated into training systems designed to condition behavior under stress. Across these cases, a pattern emerges. Each device began as something ostensibly benign, even beneficial. Each demonstrated an ability to influence cognition in ways that bypassed conscious resistance, and each was confiscated at the moment its implications became impossible to contain within civilian oversight. The public narratives emphasized safety and responsibility, while internal documents spoke of strategic advantage and control. The devices themselves vanished into secured vaults, their existence reduced to redacted lines and vague references. What remains is a fragmented record suggesting that the boundary between influencing the mind and controlling it was crossed quietly, deliberately, and without public consent and without. The second segment of this record begins not with a machine, but with a frequency. It was first identified during a classified study on crowd behavior, an effort to understand why groups sometimes respond to authority in ways that defy individual logic. Researchers were monitoring ambient electromagnetic noise in urban environments when they noticed a recurring low-intensity signal coinciding with moments of heightened compliance during public emergencies. The signal itself was not strong enough to register as a hazard, nor was it audible or visible by conventional means. Yet, when present, individuals exposed to it demonstrated a marked reduction in hesitation, questioning, and resistance. Orders were followed more quickly. Instructions were accepted without scrutiny. The phenomenon was subtle enough to escape notice, but consistent enough to demand investigation. Controlled experiments soon followed in isolated facilities. Volunteers were placed in neutral environments and asked to complete routine tasks, while the signal was introduced at varying intensities. At baseline levels, participants reported nothing unusual. As exposure increased, however, researchers observed a distinct behavioral shift. Subjects became calmer, less argumentative, and increasingly deferential to experiment supervisors when given conflicting instructions. They defaulted to the most authoritative voice in the room, even when that voice contradicted their own prior decisions. Crucially, subjects did not experience this as coercion. Post-experiment interviews revealed that they believed they had acted entirely of their own accord. The internal reports from these trials avoided the language of control, favoring terms like facilitated compliance and decision streamlining. But a parallel set of documents, marked for restricted circulation, used far more direct phrasing. The signal was described as a behavioral override amplifier, capable of suppressing the neural processes associated with doubt and dissent. Neuroimaging conducted during exposure showed decreased activity in regions linked to critical evaluation and moral conflict. The signal did not implant commands. It removed the internal friction that normally resists them. As awareness of the signal's potential spread through defense and intelligence channels, the original research team lost control of the project. Oversight was transferred to a joint task group operating under emergency authorization. The signal generator was redesigned for portability and concealment, its components disguised as standard communications equipment. Field tests were conducted during simulated crisis scenarios, where participants believed they were responding to natural disasters or security threats. In every case, exposure to the signal correlated with faster compliance and reduced post-event questioning. After-action reports praised its stabilizing effect on group dynamics. Public disclosure became a concern only when fragments of the research surfaced through academic leaks. A junior researcher, unaware of the project's classified status, submitted a paper describing anomalous compliance patterns linked to environmental frequencies. Within weeks, the paper was withdrawn, the researcher reassigned, and all related data removed from open databases. Official statements cited methodological flaws internally. The incident was labeled a containment failure. The signal itself was reclassified, its frequency range designated as sensitive information. What makes this case particularly unsettling is the absence of a traditional device. There was no visible apparatus to confiscate, no laboratory prototype to display. Control existed in the modulation of an invisible field, deployable through infrastructure already embedded in modern environments, transmission towers, emergency broadcast systems. Even certain industrial emitters were identified as potential vectors. The line between communication and influence blurred beyond easy distinction. By the end of the program's documented phase, references to the signal became scarce. It did not disappear. It was absorbed. Technical manuals refer obliquely to behavioral harmonization protocols, while strategic assessments discuss the value of reducing civilian panic and resistance during large-scale operations. Whether the signal has ever been deployed outside controlled settings remains officially unanswered. What is clear is that its discovery challenged a fundamental assumption that obedience requires persuasion, force, or fear. In this case, it required only the quiet adjustment of the conditions under which choice itself is made. The third confiscated device was never intended to influence behavior in the moment. Its purpose was retrospective, aimed not at guiding decisions, but at reshaping the past as it was remembered. The apparatus took the form of a helmet, lightweight and unassuming, lined with an array of sensors and emitters, arranged to correspond with known memory encoding regions of the brain. According to its inventor, a neuroscientist working under a civilian grant, the helmet was designed to assist patients suffering from traumatic recall by selectively dampening neural pathways associated with distressing memories. It promised relief without drugs, shock therapy, or invasive procedures. Early clinical notes describe modest success, and for a brief time, the project appeared destined for quiet obscurity. That trajectory changed when researchers noticed an anomaly. Subjects did not merely experience reduced emotional response to traumatic memories. In some cases, the memories themselves became unstable, details blurred, sequences rearranged, and in rare instances, entire events seemed to vanish from conscious recall. When asked about these gaps, subjects expressed confusion rather than alarm, often rationalizing the absence as a failure of attention or natural forgetting. The implications were immediately obvious to those reviewing the data. Forgetting had always been considered a passive decay. This device suggested it could be actively engineered. Further experimentation revealed that the helmet's effect was not limited to erasure. By adjusting stimulation patterns during memory reconsolidation, researchers could subtly alter recalled experiences. An argument remembered as hostile became merely tense. A morally troubling decision was reframed as unavoidable. The changes were not dramatic enough to trigger suspicion, but they accumulated over time, reshaping personal narratives in ways that favored psychological stability and institutional loyalty. Internal correspondence refers to this as adaptive memory alignment, a phrase that avoided the more troubling reality of deliberate manipulation. Once these findings were circulated beyond the original research team, intervention was swift. Representatives from a federal oversight body arrived with formal notices citing national security concerns. The helmet, all prototypes, and the complete data archive were seized. The inventor was informed that continuation of the work would require clearance he did not possess. Publicly, the project was terminated due to ethical ambiguities. Privately, it was transferred to a closed program concerned with post-operation containment and personnel reliability. Records from that program, partially declassified decades later, suggest the helmet was refined for use on individuals exposed to sensitive information, rather than relying on non-disclosure agreements or psychological screening. The technology offered a more direct solution. Memories could be softened, fragmented, or redirected without the subject's awareness. Notably, medical evaluations reported no physical damage. Brain scans showed no lesions, no scarring, no indicators that could be used to prove interference. From the outside, the mind appeared intact. One internal review raised concerns about long-term identity drift. If memories form the backbone of personal continuity, altering them even slightly could destabilize an individual's sense of self. These concerns were acknowledged and then set aside. The prevailing argument was pragmatic. The benefits of secure knowledge containment outweighed abstract questions of authenticity. The helmet remained in use until at least the late 1980s, after which references to it disappeared from accessible files. The most unsettling aspect of this case is not the technology itself, but its invisibility. Unlike coercion or imprisonment, memory rewriting leaves no obvious trace. Those affected cannot protest what they cannot perceive. Their altered recollections feel genuine, internally consistent, and self-generated. In that sense, the helmet represented a fundamental shift in power control, exercised not through force, but through the quiet revision of what had already happened. The fourth device was not advanced in appearance, nor was it technologically complex by modern standards. It resembled a chair more than a machine, heavy, padded, and deliberately ordinary. Its power did not come from sophisticated electronics, but from an extreme manipulation of sensory input. Developed during a period when behavioral science was increasingly intertwined with national security concerns, the chair was originally described as a tool for stress resilience training. The premise was simple. By removing external stimuli, researchers believed they could observe the mind's intrinsic responses under isolation. What they discovered instead was a method for reshaping allegiance itself. Subjects placed in the chair were immobilized comfortably, their vision obscured by darkness, their hearing reduced to a low, constant hum designed to mask ambient noise. Over time, the absence of sensory reference points disrupted normal cognitive anchoring. Thoughts looped. Internal narratives lost coherence. In this state, the mind became unusually receptive to external framing. When a calm, authoritative voice was introduced through concealed speakers, subjects clung to it as their sole point of orientation. Instructions delivered in this context carried disproportionate weight, not because they were persuasive, but because they offered structure where none existed. Initial trials were conducted under the guise of endurance research. Participants were told they were helping refine training methods for astronauts and deep-sea personnel. However, the data collected focused less on stress tolerance and more on post-exposure attitudes. Subjects exhibited a marked increase in trust toward the institution overseeing the experiment. Critical opinions softened. Prior grievances were reframed as misunderstandings. Follow-up interviews revealed a curious pattern. Participants described feeling reset, as though prolonged isolation had cleared away conflicting loyalties and doubts. As word of these effects circulated within classified channels, the chair was quietly reclassified. Its original research team was removed, and the apparatus transferred to a facility specializing in psychological operations. There, protocols were refined. Duration of exposure was carefully calibrated to avoid overt breakdown while maximizing cognitive pliability. The authoritative voice was scripted, its language emphasizing stability, belonging, and shared purpose. Subjects emerged convinced that their altered outlook was the result of personal reflection rather than external influence. Ethical objections surfaced intermittently, particularly from clinicians concerned about induced dependency and identity erosion. These objections were addressed procedurally, not substantively. Oversight committees noted that no physical harm occurred and that participation was technically voluntary. The more troubling question whether loyalty manufactured under deprivation could be considered authentic was deferred indefinitely. The chair was eventually confiscated from its original classification, not because it failed, but because it worked too predictably. Internal assessments warned that widespread knowledge of such a technique could undermine public trust in institutions altogether. If loyalty could be engineered through controlled isolation, the legitimacy of consent itself became questionable. The device was dismantled, its components dispersed, its documentation sealed. Yet the principles it demonstrated did not vanish. They informed later practices, subtler and more distributed, embedded in environments rather than apparatus. What remains of the chair's legacy is a stark reminder that control does not always announce itself through pain or fear. Sometimes it arrives through silence, through the careful removal of alternatives, leaving the mind to grasp the only certainty offered. The fifth confiscated mechanism never required physical proximity. It operated across distance, scale, and anonymity, woven into systems that already permeated everyday life. Its origin lay in an unremarkable communications study, examining how repeated exposure to certain auditory patterns influenced attention and recall. Researchers initially focused on improving clarity in emergency broadcasts, attempting to ensure that critical instructions would be remembered under stress. During testing, however, analysts noticed an unintended side effect. Listeners exposed repeatedly to specific cadence structures and tonal progressions began to exhibit measurable shifts in decision-making speed and risk tolerance, even hours after the broadcasts ended. Unlike traditional propaganda, this method did not rely on persuasive content. The words themselves were irrelevant. What mattered was rhythm, timing, and frequency modulation. When arranged correctly, these elements interacted with neural processing in ways that subtly biased interpretation. Subjects became more accepting of authoritative messaging, less inclined to question directives, and more likely to perceive compliance as rational self-interest. Crucially, they were unaware of any influence. Surveys indicated that participants believed their reactions were shaped solely by situational context. Field trials expanded quietly. Test regions were selected based on existing infrastructure density, allowing researchers to embed experimental signals within routine public transmissions. Weather alerts, traffic updates, and civil announcements served as carriers. Analysts monitored behavioral data indirectly through consumer patterns, mobility metrics, and emergency response compliance. Correlations emerged with unsettling consistency. Areas exposed to the modified broadcasts showed reduced hesitation during evacuations, increased conformity during drills, and diminished post-event criticism of authorities. As internal reports circulated, concerns were raised about scope and deniability. Unlike a confiscated device locked in a vault, a broadcast-based mechanism was inherently diffuse. Its components could not be easily isolated once deployed. This prompted a rapid escalation in classification. The research was transferred to a closed program, its civilian collaborators removed under the pretext of budget restructuring. Public-facing documentation described the changes as routine signal optimization, while technical appendices detailing cognitive impact were restricted. The most controversial phase came when simulations suggested the broadcast could influence not only compliance, but belief formation over time. Repeated exposure appeared to reinforce certain cognitive shortcuts. making individuals more receptive to future directives framed in familiar patterns. Critics within the program warned that such long-term conditioning blurred the line between public safety communication and behavioral engineering. Their objections were acknowledged, logged, and overridden by strategic assessments emphasizing stability and order. Eventually, the mechanism was officially shelved, its experimental parameters labeled too sensitive for continued development. The broadcast reverted to standard formats, and the program's existence faded from accessible records. Yet the infrastructure remained unchanged, and the underlying principles were never disproven. What had been demonstrated was a capacity to shape thought patterns without targeting individuals, without devices to confiscate, and without leaving evidence that could be contested. In this case, control did not arrive through force or confinement, but through familiarity. It arrived on trusted channels, wrapped in routine information, altering cognition not by commanding obedience, but by quietly adjusting the way choices felt before they were even made. The sixth confiscated technology crossed a threshold that previous methods had only approached indirectly. It did not rely on environment, signal, or deprivation. It resided inside the body itself. Officially, it was introduced as a medical breakthrough, a neural implant designed to stabilize severe mood disorders by regulating abnormal emotional spikes. The prototype was small, implanted near the limbic system, and programmed to monitor neural activity in real time. When patterns associated with anxiety, rage, or panic emerged, the implant delivered a corrective pulse, restoring equilibrium. Early trials appeared promising. Patients reported unprecedented emotional clarity, describing their inner states as calm, orderly, and manageable. What alarmed researchers was not the implant's success, but its precision. Over time, engineers discovered that emotional regulation could be decoupled from pathology. The implant did not merely suppress extremes, it could be tuned to dampen specific categories of response. Fear toward authority figures could be softened. Anger triggered by perceived injustice could be reduced to mild irritation. Even grief responses could be shortened, compressed into brief, manageable intervals. The emotional spectrum itself became adjustable. Internal debates emerged over how to classify these capabilities. Some argued that emotional modulation was still therapeutic, an extension of psychiatric care. Others recognized a more profound implication: if emotional reactions guided moral judgment and resistance, then controlling those reactions effectively controlled behavior. A subject who could not sustain anger at wrongdoing or fear of consequence would behave differently, regardless of conscious belief. The implant's development was transferred to a restricted program under the justification of preventing misuse. In practice, this meant expansion rather than limitation. New versions included remote calibration features, allowing authorized operators to adjust thresholds without the subject's awareness. Field tests were conducted on volunteers drawn from sensitive operational roles. Reports indicated improved reliability, reduced dissent, and heightened mission focus. Subjects described feeling balanced and clear-headed, unaware that their emotional responses were being selectively gated. Ethical oversight documents reveal mounting unease. Reviewers questioned whether consent could remain valid when the implant itself influenced the emotional basis of decision-making. These concerns were met with procedural reassurances. Participants signed agreements. Medical monitoring showed no harm, and removal remained technically possible. What went unaddressed was the asymmetry of knowledge. Subjects could feel the effects, but not the mechanisms shaping them. The implant was ultimately confiscated from its original medical classification after external scrutiny threatened exposure. Official statements framed the seizure as a precaution against premature commercialization. Internally, the technology was preserved, its documentation sealed, and its use narrowed to programs deemed essential. Public research into similar implants continued, carefully avoiding the configurations that had revealed behavioral leverage. This case marks a pivotal evolution. Earlier devices influenced cognition indirectly, through environment or memory. The implant transformed emotion itself into a controllable variable, a switch that could be turned up or down as circumstances required. In doing so, it redefined autonomy not as freedom of thought, but as freedom of feeling, and demonstrated how easily that freedom could be taken away without the subject ever realizing it. The seventh mechanism never touched the body, the senses, or the memory directly. It operated upstream, before dissent could fully form. Its origins trace back to a data analysis initiative intended to improve organizational cohesion by identifying stress points within large institutions. Analysts aggregated communication metadata, work patterns, and behavioral indicators to forecast burnout and attrition. Early results were accurate enough to draw attention, but what transformed the project was a secondary discovery. Certain constellations of micro-behaviors reliably preceded acts of resistance. Missed meetings, subtle shifts in language, changes in sleep-linked activity taken alone, they meant nothing. Taken together, they formed a signature. Developers refined the model, feeding it historical datasets that included strikes, leaks, refusals, and whistleblowing events. The algorithm learned to recognize pre-dissent states days or weeks before individuals themselves articulated a grievance. Internal validation tests boasted predictive accuracy that exceeded chance by a wide margin. The language used to describe these results was cautious, but the implications were unmistakable. If dissent could be predicted, it could be redirected or prevented. Implementation began quietly, rather than punitive measures. The system triggered supportive interventions. Individuals flagged by the algorithm received schedule adjustments, counseling offers, or reassignment to less contentious roles. On the surface, these actions appeared benevolent, internally. Their purpose was clear: to disrupt the trajectory toward resistance by altering context and incentives before opposition crystallized. Follow-up analysis showed a significant reduction in overt dissent among monitored populations. Concerns arose when the algorithm began recommending more assertive interventions. In high-sensitivity environments, flagged individuals were subjected to increased supervision, delayed promotions, or preemptive evaluations. None of these actions were framed as discipline. Each was justified as routine management. Yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Potential dissenters found their capacity to organize, influence, or even fully form objections diminished. As the system's scope expanded, so did its classification. The algorithm was rebranded as a stability analytics platform. Its original research context obscured. External auditors were shown sanitized outputs that emphasized wellness metrics. The dissent prediction modules were compartmentalized, accessible only to cleared operators. When a limited disclosure threatened to reveal the system's true capabilities, the platform was confiscated from civilian oversight and folded into a classified program. What makes this case distinct is the absence of coercion in the traditional sense. No commands were issued, no memories altered, no emotions dampened directly. Control was exercised through anticipation, by intervening before resistance became conscious. The system preserved the appearance of free choice while shaping outcomes in advance. Individuals believed they had simply changed their minds, lost momentum, or moved on. The algorithm's documentation ends abruptly, replaced by references to successor systems and enhanced forecasting. Whether the original model remains in use is unclear. What is clear is that it demonstrated a profound shift in control power, exercised not by suppressing dissent, but by ensuring it never fully emerged. The eighth confiscated apparatus was not designed to persuade, condition, or predict. It was built to explore perception itself, specifically the relationship between time and identity. Officially, It was a sensory research chamber, developed to study how altered temporal perception affected decision-making under stress. The chamber was windowless, acoustically isolated, and lined with materials engineered to absorb vibration and external reference cues. Inside, subjects were exposed to carefully modulated light cycles and sound patterns intended to stretch or compress the subjective experience of time. Early trials produced expected results. Participants misjudged duration, overestimating or underestimating how long they had been inside. What startled researchers was the psychological aftermath. Extended exposure led not merely to temporal distortion, but to a weakening of personal narrative continuity. Subjects reported difficulty anchoring themselves to a stable sense of before and after. Memories lost chronological order. Goals felt abstract and disconnected. In interviews, participants struggled to articulate who they were outside the chamber, describing their identity as fluid or provisional. Further experimentation intensified these effects. When time cues were disrupted beyond certain thresholds, the mind compensated by dissolving boundaries. Emotional attachments faded. Personal convictions lost urgency, authority. When reintroduced as a temporal anchor, assumed disproportionate importance. A calm voice reminding subjects of their role, name, and obligations became a lifeline, restoring coherence in exchange for guidance. Researchers noted that subjects emerging from the chamber exhibited heightened dependence on external structure, often deferring major decisions to institutional frameworks rather than personal judgment. Internal documents reveal growing concern over the chamber's potential as a tool for identity erosion. Unlike memory editing, which targeted specific experiences, temporal distortion undermined the scaffolding that held experiences together. Without a reliable sense of time, continuity of self weakened. Ethical reviews flagged risks of long-term dissociation and loss of autonomy. These warnings coincided with increased interest from agencies tasked with managing high-risk detainees and defectors. The chamber was confiscated under emergency authority. Its civilian research mandate terminated. Official explanations cited safety concerns and funding realignment. In classified assessments, however, the chamber was praised for its ability to induce compliance without overt force. Subjects did not feel controlled. They felt unmoored. Control emerged as relief, offered in exchange for direction. Subsequent records suggest the chamber was dismantled and its principles distributed across smaller, more portable systems. Training environments incorporated temporal manipulation through variable schedules and disorienting routines. Detention protocols adopted similar techniques to weaken resistance by eroding narrative continuity. The original chamber disappeared from inventories, its existence reduced to footnotes and declassified annexes. What distinguishes this case is its philosophical depth. By altering the perception of time, the chamber demonstrated that identity itself is contingent, dependent on continuity and context. Remove those anchors, and the self becomes negotiable. In that state, control does not need to be imposed. It is requested. The ninth confiscated method was pharmacological, but unlike conventional psychoactive substances, it did not dull the senses or impair cognition. It was developed under a behavioral chemistry program seeking alternatives to sedation for high-stress operational environments. The compound's stated goal was efficiency, to reduce hesitation in moments where delay could prove fatal. Early laboratory tests showed that the drug did not induce euphoria, lethargy, or hallucination. Subjects remained alert, articulate, and physically capable. What changed was internal dialogue. Participants consistently reported a striking absence of inner conflict. Decisions that would normally provoke anxiety or moral uncertainty were experienced as straightforward and obvious. Neurochemical analysis suggested the compound selectively dampened activity in neural circuits associated with rumination and ethical tension. While leaving executive function intact, in effect, it quieted the mental space where doubt and self-questioning reside. Subjects did not feel controlled. They felt decisive. Field trials expanded rapidly. The drug was administered in controlled doses to individuals in training simulations. Performance metrics improved across the board. Reaction times decreased. Task completion rates increased. After-action interviews revealed a uniform narrative. Participants described feeling clear, resolved, and unusually aligned with mission objectives. When questioned about potential moral concerns, they expressed surprise, often stating that such concerns had not occurred to them at the time. This absence of conflict raised alarms among a minority of program reviewers. Internal memos questioned whether moral hesitation was being treated as a defect rather than a safeguard. These concerns were countered by strategic analyses emphasizing operational necessity. The drug did not compel action, proponents argued. It merely removed unnecessary psychological friction. Consent forms were updated, language softened, and the program continued. The turning point came when longitudinal studies revealed a persistence effect. Repeated exposure appeared to recalibrate baseline cognition. Subjects showed reduced propensity for ethical deliberation even off the drug, suggesting that neural pathways associated with conflict resolution were being weakened through disuse. The implication was profound. A temporary aid was becoming a lasting modification. When external oversight threatened to scrutinize the program, the compound was confiscated from its original research classification. Officially, it was deemed too subtle, its effects too difficult to regulate. Internally, it was preserved under restricted access, reserved for scenarios described as exceptional. Public research into similar compounds avoided this pathway entirely, focusing instead on sedation or stimulation, methods whose effects were easier to detect. The drug's legacy lies in its demonstration that control need not suppress thought or emotion overtly, by silencing the internal negotiation that precedes choice. It transformed action into reflex while preserving the illusion of agency. Subjects believed they were acting freely, unaware that the space where freedom normally wrestles with conscience had been chemically muted. The final entry is not a device, signal, chamber, algorithm, or compound in isolation. It is the framework that absorbed them all. As each method demonstrated its effectiveness, a problem emerged within classified planning circles: fragmentation. Individual tools worked, but they operated independently, governed by different oversight structures, ethical justifications, and deployment limits. The solution was not technological, it was doctrinal. A unifying program was established to integrate cognitive influence into a single operational philosophy, one that treated the human mind as a system to be stabilized, optimized, and guided rather than coerced. This program did not announce itself with a name that suggested control. Its language emphasized resilience, continuity, and security. Internal documents describe a shift from intervention to environmental governance. The objective was no longer to apply influence reactively, but to design conditions under which deviation became unlikely: memory editing, emotional modulation, predictive analytics, sensory manipulation, pharmacological dampening, and broadcast influence were no longer separate projects. They became layers, each reinforcing the others, deployed selectively based on context. Training materials reveal a chilling clarity. Influence was to be applied invisibly whenever possible. Subjects should never feel acted upon. The most successful outcome was described as one in which individuals believed they had arrived at desired conclusions independently. Compliance achieved through fear or force was considered unstable. Compliance achieved through alignment was durable. This required coordination across institutions, technologies, and timeframes, a level of integration only possible once the methods themselves were classified beyond public accountability. Oversight mechanisms existed, but they were internal, circular, and insulated. Ethical reviews focused on outcomes rather than processes, stability rather than consent. The program's architects argued that modern complexity demanded such measures. In a world of cascading crises, misinformation, and rapid mobilization, the margin for dissent-induced delay was framed as an unacceptable risk. Control, in this doctrine, was rebranded as stewardship. The program's existence is difficult to trace because it left no single artifact to uncover. Its presence is inferred through harmonized policy shifts, converging research terminations, and recurring language across otherwise unrelated documents. Where one method faced exposure, it was withdrawn, only to reappear as a principle embedded elsewhere. Nothing vanished, it diffused. What distinguishes this final stage is not the sophistication of its tools, but the ambition of its scope. Earlier devices sought to influence behavior. This program sought to define the boundaries within which behavior occurred. It did not ask whether individuals agreed. It ensured that disagreement felt unnecessary, impractical, or inconceivable. Freedom was preserved in form, constrained in function. The record ends without resolution. There is no formal termination notice, no declaration of success or failure. The doctrine simply fades from explicit mention, replaced by assumptions so normalized they no longer require justification. If control once needed machines, signals, and chambers, it now resides in architecture, process, and expectation. And in that sense, the most effective system was the one that no longer needed to be hidden, because it no longer needed to be seen.